Good afternoon, everybody. It's Tim Richter here from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. I'm just going to give everybody a minute to log in, and then we'll get started with Ian right away. We'll be back in just a minute. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. As I said, it's Tim Richter here from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. I want to welcome you to this Canadian Shelter Transformation webinar with Ian DeYoung of OrgCode. This is the first of a series of webinars that we're going to be doing, building on some of the work that Ian and the CSTN have done sort of pre-COVID in a world that existed before COVID. I don't remember much about it, but glad to have Ian back. We're going to just do some quick housekeeping before I turn it over to Ian. The agenda for the webinar is pretty straightforward. We're going to have I'll do a brief introduction. Ian will have his presentation. We'll give everybody an opportunity for questions and answers, and then we will wrap. Quick housekeeping, just so you know, everyone is muted. We've got quite a few people on the call today. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, please put them in the Q&A tab in order to ask questions. If you want to share comments or speak with other participants, feel free to use the chat. Also, feel free to use the chat if you have materials you want to share. The recording is, the webinar is being recorded and is going to be posted at transformshelter.ca/webinar. The link you see below, we'll put that up in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Ian DeYoung. So most of you will know of Ian. I remember as we were contemplating setting up the CSTN and looking at how we transform shelters. I started asking around my network around North America. I asked a dozen people. I said, who's really doing housing focused shelter well? Who knows how you do this, and who would be the top consultant, the top expert in your mind? And exclusively, without any exaggeration, Ian was the name that everybody I spoke to in the shelter system, in the training world, in the expert world across North America, all were recommending that we talk to Ian. And here we are. Ian's done some great work for the CSTN. On their resources page, there's a toolkit, self-assessment guide on emergency shelter, and recordings of our previous webinars with Ian. And that's where this one will be. I will now stop sharing and allow Ian to switch on his presentation from what looks like Northern Ontario. And someday you'll all get to see his I think his Star Wars background, prison back. He's got a wide selection of very entertaining backgrounds, but I will leave that to him to pick and choose the ones. All right, I will disappear in the background and turn it over to Ian. Thanks, Ian. Over to you.
And thanks, Tim, for such a kind introduction, and a very good day to everybody here. It really is my pleasure to be part of a conversation, a continuing conversation on housing-focused shelter, and in particular today to put some time and energy into examining how are housing-focused shelters trauma-informed, why are they trauma-informed, And what can we be doing relative to specific populations that use shelter that might help with trauma recovery if we have a strong housing orientation? It's been a great delight for me, one of the few bright spots, I'll say, during this time of COVID, to hear from different shelters throughout the country that are embracing becoming housing focused or are continuing their journey in being housing focused, and some of the remarkable results they've been able to achieve in helping people access and maintain housing during this very trying time. It goes to prove that this work is never easy, but is possible even when there are circumstances that are less than ideal for how we might want to go about doing this work. So a good welcome to all you. I think Tim did a good job of setting up the webinar for today, and a very humbling way to hear him speak about me and the work that we do at OrCode relative to shelter transformation. If you are in the realm of providing shelter, welcome. And if you are frontline, middle management, or executive, welcome. If you are outside the shelter world but care passionately about shelters, welcome. If you are just new to understanding what shelters do and their role and responsibility, welcome. And if you are an individual or family that uses shelter, you are also welcome here. A little bit about OrCode. We do a fair amount of work in homeless system transformation. We also do work in leadership development and technical assistance. A big part of our work these days is related to shelter transformation, addressing encampments, working to transform towards housing-based systems of care. And COVID response has been part of our work to make sure that communities and organizations stay focused on not just managing homelessness, but also opportunities for ending homelessness during this time. We do try to disrupt the status quo and catalyst for better outcomes. We want to see performance improved so the lives of people experiencing homelessness is improved. And we think that the greatest way to improve those lives in most instances is going to be through diverting people from homelessness. If people do experiencing homelessness, making sure it's rare and brief. And if someone does experience homelessness and moves into housing, that it only happens once in their life and they don't recur into the experience of homelessness again. We are thought leaders in ending homelessness, advance ideas, create and share resources, a lot of which you can find on our website, orgo.com. And we offer training that at least hopefully doesn't suck. I'm going to speak for approximately 40 to 45 minutes today. I would encourage you to use the Q&A function to record your questions, of which will be a time at the end where we'll get to as many of those as we can. Tim will help moderate those. And I'm going to ask you to do one thing using the chat function right at the very beginning. So this is a free-for-all in the chat function. It's a brainstorming exercise. We're going to give it all of 30 seconds. And that is, can you list all the ways that some shelters, not yours, but other shelters that perhaps you've heard of, are not trauma-informed? So as many ideas as you can generate right now in the chat function, all the ways in which a shelter may not be trauma-informed. Go. Pile them in there, 20 seconds to go. Yes, keep it coming. This will feel therapeutic. Get it out there. All right. This could go on for a long part of a while. In fact, if we were to brainstorm, and you can keep putting them in as we go, and I'll even scan a few at the end when we're doing the Q&A, the truth of the matter is it's quite easy to think of the ways in which shelter isn't trauma-informed. The ways in which trauma might actually be induced within the shelter delivery system. And it's not to pick on shelters that may be trauma-inducing, it's to realize that we haven't necessarily had the conversation as a community and as a country around what does it mean to be more housing focused in our shelter delivery, and what does it mean to be more trauma-informed in their pursuit. Those are the key concepts that I want to start off with today. I'm then going to underline some assumptions with you, and I'll walk through the 6 tenets of trauma-informed care in a housing-focused shelter with a very specific orientation towards how do we implement certain aspects of being housing-focused that decreases the likelihood of trauma occurring. So we're not trauma-proofing people, we're using a trauma-informed care, and we're potentially interrupting the cycle of trauma, as well as promoting the opportunities for trauma recovery through housing. And then lastly, the section that I want to talk about, and I'll just be briefly going through it, are trauma, housing, and various population groups. because it is the sort of thing that comes up from time to time in working through housing focused shelter. A well-intentioned individual or shelter provider will say, but what about insert name of population? And I want to walk through how the various ways in which we deliver housing focused shelter actually can decrease, minimize, or actually interrupt the trauma cycle for many different population groups. So these key concepts. It struck me as I was preparing this webinar, and I've been so thankful to be part of webinars up to this point in time, that we haven't necessarily drilled down into describing what exactly we mean by housing focused. Sure, it means helping people access housing, but what does that mean in the context of shelter? And how is it that being housing focused is different from other ways of operating shelter? So the first thing that I'll say is that housing focused shelter is still emergency accommodation. It doesn't change the fact that we are trying to provide accommodation for that individual adult, youth, or family that has no safe and appropriate alternatives other than needing shelter. And this really is the bread and butter the shelters play within our system. The ability to respond effectively and safely when people have no other accommodation. But the slight difference in doing that is a housing focused shelter sees the purpose of shelter as being a process rather than a destination. And it's the process by which people get rehoused. And when we say that shelter could, in other instances, be a destination, you can look around a shelter, whether that's your shelter, shelters in your community, shelters you've heard about, and you can tell the distinction between housing focused shelters and shelters that are destination oriented by the type and volume of programming they deliver. If you get into shelter as a destination, we tend to see a lot of programming that can absolutely make people's lives better, but prolongs their homelessness. Some of those programming elements that are provided are multi-week or multi-part in nature. In other words, to complete your course of quote unquote life skills training, whatever that really means, because it varies from place to place, you have to go through 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 12 weeks and then you get a certificate. But it can inadvertently prolong people's homelessness. And in prolonging people's homelessness, make them more exposed to traumas that are possible to be experienced while homeless and while in shelter. We also make a distinction between emergency accommodation of a housing focused shelter and different type of institutions that might try to deliver rehabilitation services, treatment services, stabilization services, or housing readiness services. So we don't believe that a housing focused shelter can also be a treatment center, or it can also be a place to do long-term rehab. It's not to say there isn't a place for those. In fact, most communities will benefit by having a robust array of social services that can meet a range of people's needs. But it's misguided to put that within the emergency accommodation field and still say that we're trying to focus on housing as the outcome, because those sorts of initiatives that get put into shelter can end up being the antithesis of being housing focused. How does this work? Well, a housing focused shelter starts with diversion in all instances. And diversion being the ability to exhaust every appropriate, safe alternative other than staying in shelter for every single individual and family that shows up at the shelter. Where that's not possible, either because of time of day or because there is no immediate diversion opportunity for that specific circumstance, then we practice rapid resolution, trying to help those individuals and families that need to come into shelter reattach to housing as quickly as possible. Now, that reattaching to shelter, as I'll cover a little bit today, doesn't always have to mean independent unit. In fact, housing is a social construct that requires a wide variety of interpretations to make sure that it is culturally appropriate, to make sure that it's age appropriate, to make sure that we respect people's financial situation, their degree of ability, and their independence or ability to achieve the greatest independence possible. This housing focused shelter is going to be purposeful, thoughtful, and deliberate in how it uses data. Housing focused shelters tend to be very smart shelters. They're not the sort of place where you'll just see pandemonium and busyness and chaos on a regular basis. In fact, housing focused shelters tend to bring the temperature down within the shelter because there's a unifying purpose of intention amongst all staff and the guests that use that shelter. The housing focused shelter measures success by shortening lengths of stay, so you start to see reductions in length of stay over time. having positive exits from shelter, and not returning to shelter in the future. Throughout our country, there are shelters that are already in this realm of using data quite intentionally, deliberately, thoughtfully, to understand their population, assign staff, and work towards housing outcomes. I tip my hat to the likes of Mission Services in Hamilton, who's done a great job in this regard, or the Calgary Drop-In. Housing focused shelter is unrelenting in focusing on housing as a solution to homelessness. Now, this might happen through coordinated access, but it might happen outside of coordinated access as well. If the person has the economic means to be housed, does not require further supports, and as I said, might include the likes of family reunification rather than independent lodging. So if it's unrelenting in focusing on housing as a solution to homelessness, it means that we can still be holistic. Yes, we can still help manage care for a health-related issue. But we don't have to look at the care of the health-related issue at the expense of helping that individual or family get housed. Those two things can, in fact, co-occur in our desire to help people make sure their length of stay is as short as possible and that they have a positive place to leave upon exit. What we want to do in a housing-focused shelter is maximize resiliency. You know, we could do an entire session on what the heck that means. But think of it this way. I build upon the strengths of every single person so that I can customize an approach to being housing focused with their specific strengths. Not cookie cutter, not one size fits all, down to the specific strengths of every single individual and family. To make that possible, the staff that work within a housing focused shelter have to see rehousing as an intervention. So it's not a program that just exists in a vacuum. It's not about just having housing workers who sometimes are in the shelter engaging with people, sometimes are not, or certain staff within the shelter that are specialized in housing and nobody else speaks the language of housing. We get bottlenecks that way, and the system starts to really cramp around in its momentum around moving forward in that regard. But if we see it as an intervention, it also means the shelter staff are active in engaging with shelter guests about housing. And the whole reason being, they want to interfere with the trajectory of homelessness to make that experience as short as possible. How do they do it? Do they bully people? No. Do they force people to accept housing? No. Do they threaten to kick people out if they don't accept housing? No. They use persuasion. Persuasion being the tool in the toolkit that will allow people to explore the opportunities of moving into housing as an alternative to staying in shelter. And it doesn't use threats of punishment to get people to focus on housing. Housing remains a voluntary initiative. If you change the culture of the shelter to be housing focused, you can also expect that the culture amongst the guests change. And many of the guests that start using shelter thereafter becoming more housing focused will seek the same solution that other shelter guests have received in the past, which is namely housing. Common engagement stages in housing focused shelter are these 5. And we could probably break some of these into subsections, but for just use of time within this webinar, I'll say here are the major ones. Diversion, a very structured approach to engagement prior to intake to try to help individuals, families, youth explore alternatives to coming in shelter. When it meets both criteria, it's safe and appropriate to do so. 2, that the intake process is more than an administrative and rule-setting process, but rather the second great opportunity we have to focus our attention on what it means to be housing focused. To deliver rapid resolution after the intake period, so we might say that from day 1 up to day 14, where staff will want to engage on a regular basis to help every single person within that shelter focus on ways in which they can still find housing, usually separate and apart from coordinated access up to that point. And then we get through this like post 14-day up to 30-day engagement, the greenish arrow, which is where we want to drill a little bit deeper into what happens, how do we support that individual or family that has not been able to get on a trajectory towards housing quickly within their shelter stay. The good news, if we do those 4 parts of the arrow really well, we'll have a decrease in the number of people who hit the dark blue at the end, which are those that are still in shelter after 30 days And I'll add to that, and don't have a housing opportunity that's in play yet for them. Trauma and trauma-informed care is the other feature of today's webinar. So at a high level, to make sure we're on the same page, because this gets interpreted or assumed different ways, I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about our interpretation of trauma and trauma-informed care, and this should look familiar to you if you've been part of any of our trauma-informed care training initiatives, or if you've participated in any sort of trauma-informed care training in the past. So first of all, we think about trauma as event, experience, and effect. It's an event or series of events or set of circumstances, and they are experienced usually as physically or emotionally harmful and have lasting adverse effects on functioning physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. When we take a trauma-informed approach, we are starting from the position that trauma is quite prevalent in our society. Now, if we look at data related to that, we'll see that there are variations between people who identify as men and people who identify as women, as one example. We'll also see that people, for example, who are refugees or immigrants may have different prevalence and experiences as someone who identifies as a white Canadian. That we'll see the prevalence of trauma very different within Indigenous populations as we will other populations. And it's not a game of who has the most trauma. It merely respects, and it doesn't say we do it exclusively for those populations. It says, look, trauma is so widespread, everything we do should be trauma informed. Because trauma impacts individuals. We want to resist re-traumatizing people, of which many different shelters can traumatize people or re-traumatize people, and responds by putting knowledge into practice. In other words, it's not just enough to say, I'm trauma informed and I've been through training. It's what are you doing about it? How are you making this work in your day-to-day practice? We look at a range of multitude of sources of trauma and understand that trauma can be acute, chronic, or complex. We know that trauma is more common amongst people who experience homelessness than people who don't experience homelessness. It's also more readily found in people that experience economic poverty, live with addiction, mental illness, or chronic disease. These are people that have experienced sudden, unexpected events that caused harm that they could not stop from occurring. When we get into the provision of trauma-informed care, therefore, we have to be strength-based. This is grounded in what? An understanding of and responsiveness to the impact of trauma, emphasizing physical, psychological, and emotional safety for both providers and survivors, so you and the people you serve. Then it creates opportunities for survivors, and here's what I think is the key part of this definition. To rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. If we think about attaining housing as an outcome of sheltering, does that not allow that individual or family, in most instances, to rebuild a sense of control and be empowered to be housed? We have to be vigilant in the provision of trauma-informed care. We have to avoid institutional processes as well as individual practices, but I'll stress institutional processes that are likely to re-traumatize individuals who already have histories of trauma. And do we do this to people? No. Do we do housing for people? No. We do housing with people. Consumer participation is incredibly important in how we develop, deliver, and evaluate our services related to the provision of housing. And we review all trauma-related symptoms and behaviors as an individual's best and most resilient attempt to manage, cope with, and rise above their experience of trauma. We have to change the conversation from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. This grounding of reality for us allows us to be much more non-judgmental in our engagement with people towards the pursuit of housing. It also means that we don't see shelters as places of therapeutic incarceration, where we hold on to an individual or family longer and longer and longer to try to help them get more and more ready for housing, that somehow we can heal or fix them to make that be more successful. And instead respects the fact that people will come with different degrees of trauma, and that even with their trauma, they can be housed. And in fact, once achieved housing, are in many instances more likely to recover from their trauma and/or not be as sensitized to the experience of their trauma moving forward. These are the 6 tenets of trauma-informed care. I will be running through how each of these relates to housing-focused shelter in just a few minutes, although I'm going to flip the order around, and I'm definitely going to start by talking about cultural, historic, and gender issues right off the top when we get into this in a moment. First, let me outline the assumptions. So my core assumptions are homelessness is almost always traumatic. Now, it doesn't mean it always is, but it almost always is. The other thing that is, I think, a core assumption is that if we keep people homeless longer, even inadvertently, even with our best intentions, there's actually greater risk of further exposure to trauma within the experience of being homeless. So I think, for example, around the experience of women who are homeless and the conversations I've had with women service providers, both in Canada and the United States, who are really embracing housing-focused shelters and seeing that they are actually better able to get women connected with safe and appropriate services and community with the right supports and housing to the betterment of the people that they're serving, whereas historically some of those same shelters said we tried to keep women here longer so they would feel safer and participate in group and not have actually housing outcomes flowing. But when we focused on housing and still wrapped the supports around and still made group participation possible and still did safety planning, that they're seeing better outcomes for the people that they're serving. Core assumption: homelessness is not a punishment, housing is not a reward. We don't just house the people we like. We don't just house the people we think, oh, well, you're putting in your time and your energy and you're really motivated. You deserve housing. And you, oh, you're not working hard enough. You haven't got your stuff together yet. You need to stay homeless longer until you realize the value of being housed. Obviously, I'm being flippant, but the sentiment is quite real in action that you see in various shelters throughout the country. Trauma-informed approaches to service delivery should be the de facto way to deliver all services, given how widespread trauma is, and that many people who experience homelessness also experience cumulative or chronic trauma, and that doesn't necessarily go away just because someone moves into a shelter, and doesn't necessarily immediately go away when someone moves into housing either. I'm not naive. That said, if it's widespread, cumulative, and chronic, and we can decrease the impacts or likelihood of it disabling the person in their life, shouldn't we do that? Neither housing nor trauma recovery are one size fits all. So the application of the 6 tenets of trauma-informed care and housing-focused shelter. Starting with cultural, historic, and gender issues. So home is a social construct, as I said before. If we wanted to, we could rename this housing-focused shelter instead of calling it housing-focused shelter, we could call it positive exit-focused shelter. It doesn't have the same ring to it, may not be as easily understood as the people that you're working with. But this idea that housing cannot be viewed exclusively as a white male heteronormative colonial construct. There's different types of housing. For some people, it'll be congregate living. For some people, it's independent living. For some people, it's going to be in small towns and communities and rural environments. For other people, it'll be in the throes of a major metropolitan area right downtown. For some people, it's supportive housing and with a lot of supports. For other people, it's culturally appropriate supports that are customized relative to the needs of the population group that is moving into housing. It respects as well that there are unique attributes and strengths of every single person that we house, and we really need to follow their lead in terms of determining the right focus of housing supports and the right type of housing location for them. This changes some of the narrative that's used when we talk about housing. We no longer should be talking about housing placements. We should be talking about housing choices. And those choices are acquired, so housing acquisition is driven by the unique opportunities and strengths of the individual or family being housed. To do this well, we have to consider cultural safety and cultural humility. We have to understand intergenerational trauma impacts, particularly amongst some population groups where intergenerational trauma is more rampant. We have to look at safety and appropriateness of all housing. So I'm not saying, nor will I ever say, that housing people in a slumlord's place where there's terrible living conditions that's not fit for human habitation. It is going to be further damaging to people. It's a violent environment. I'm never going to suggest that that is the sort of housing that we're talking about. And we're going to look for opportunities for inclusion and community connectivity. In other words, this isn't just about getting people into housing and leaving them in housing. This is about including people in housing in a range of community-based engagements and opportunities and meaningful daily activities. What is housing intended to do? Provide safety, emotional and physical, allow for people to exercise their autonomy and self-expression, allow for community connectivity, allow people to achieve the greatest amount of independence possible, respecting that some people may benefit or want supports for a longer period in their life, and looks at the prevention of potential impacts and trauma of longer-term homelessness. So by getting people into housing sooner, we're trying to prevent the likelihood that things would be more traumatic if they stayed homeless longer. On the element of safety, we know, based upon available data that I've seen, that there's less likelihood to be involved in violence or threatened with violence if you move into housing compared to the same likelihood and propensity of violence while remaining homeless. This includes both shelter violence and street violence. It includes both physical violence, threats of physical violence, and sexual violence. We want to create an environment where housing provides an opportunity for people as necessary to lock their doors and close their windows and keep the world out, or perhaps some days keep themselves in. That if we think about the right supports for assisting people, we can also create an environment where housing is more safe by bringing resources to the individual as necessary, rather than expecting the person to navigate all the community resources on their own. Housing allows for more emotional safety. So this gets back into these constructs of home and what home actually means outside of housing. When we actually get around to supporting people right and providing opportunities for meaningful daily activities, housing is not an out of sight, out of mind game with the people that we're working with. It can be instrumental in recovery. This is true of things like mental health recovery is improved with housing stability, substance use recovery is improved with housing stability, emotional recovery is more likely to occur in housing. Even aspects of economic recovery, I would argue, are more likely to be achieved when people are in housing. And if you serve families, you're probably well aware of the broad range of literature that shows that children and families do better in housing than they do in shelter. And in fact, longer shelter stays where children are involved can be very disruptive to development and a range of social aspects of being a child. Shelter should be a place of social service, not a place of social control. This reorients us to take that trauma-informed perspective, because it's not about me asserting power, it's about mutually collaborating with people to define the experience of safety. It's not do what I say or else you have to get out of here. It's about working with people and socializing those expectations so they can actually be met. One of the great social services we provide then is opportunities for people to exit their homelessness. Also, let's be honest, shelters are a pretty intrusive place. You've got other people. Depending on the size of your shelter, you may have many staff, and there's lots of information that's gathered. That ranges from bureaucratic administrative information right through to assessment information to even housing information. It seems that one of the things we excel best at in the delivery of shelter is actually the accumulation of information. And we don't necessarily use that information a lot, but I'll leave that for another day too. Housing resolves these issues. When you move into housing, there's not the same degree of intrusiveness. Yes, you may still have a worker or other community-based supports that you're connected to, but that shouldn't be as intrusive as having all your laundry aired out potentially in front of everybody else in the shelter, or knowing that staff are potentially going to talk to each other about an individual, or trying to navigate what do I say and what do I not say that's going to allow me to get shelter in the first place. Rather, people have the opportunity to be more authentic themselves, and as a result, receive more authentic service. Whenever it's safe and appropriate, as I've said about 3 times now, housing is an appropriate exit from shelter. And also the different types of housing can be matched to the specific emotional and physical safety needs of each person or family. Trustworthiness, sometimes referred to as trustworthiness through transparency. We have a desire to, we are therefore forthright and transparent in keeping people out of shelter if there's, here it is again, safe and appropriate alternatives. If people do need to come into shelter, to make the stay as short as possible with a positive exit. And we do want people to be successful in housing and never needing to return to shelter in the future. Gone are the days where we might have started by saying, listen, go out, get an apartment, but look, if it doesn't work out, just come on back to us. That sort of cycle of in and out of housing and back to shelter, because we created it as a space where people always felt welcome, may not be in the best interest of the people that we're serving if we can actually do better connectivity to housing with the right supports in ways that are safe and culturally appropriate. Housing-focused shelters themselves want to be held accountable to these three measures. And it's one of the ways that in our work, we can really tell that shelters are starting to become more ingrained in a housing-focused framework, is they don't make excuses of why they can't do diversion. They don't make excuses of why they can't do rapid resolution. They don't make excuses when people come back to shelter. They analyze that data and they learn from it. Now, let's just focus on that first bullet for a moment, and this idea that diversion itself is an effort of building trust with people. It's essentially being remarkably clear that we only want you to use it if you absolutely have to need shelter. And if you do, great, we will provide a super safe, great experience of working towards getting out of shelter. But if we don't try diversion, if we say we can't do diversion, or where would we divert people to, or our staff don't have time. I mean, I'll tell you for a moment about a great housing-focused shelter in Gainesville, Florida, Rice Marketplace. Since the pandemic began, they have continued over 40% diversion with single men. Over 40%. Not because they have tons more resources, not because they've invented some secret diversion sauce, but because they decided that at this time, even more so, they needed to double their efforts to problem solve effectively, so that they were only going to bring people into shelter at this time that absolutely had no safe and appropriate place to be. Shelter staff are also going to be honest with people and transparent, that we're working on housing, here's why we're working on housing, that they are trustworthy, they actually demonstrate that they can help people get housed, and they'll be authentic throughout that entire housing process. As an aside, and I have no literature to support this, it will just be an opinion based upon experience. If there's one thing I also think is true, is that people who have been affected by trauma can smell inauthenticity from a mile away. Housing-focused shelters that have an orientation towards being trauma-informed also use peer supports. How? Well, we want input of people with lived experience to look at our programs and services and tell us what we can do to become more housing focused. See, we sometimes get into our own heads that we think we have all the answers and that we're going to figure out all the answers on our own. And if we just have enough smart staff or hire the right person, we'll figure this out. You already have a bunch of experts who maybe have never been tapped into asking, how would you make what we do more housing focused? They may have all sorts of answers that surprise you, from the policy that makes no sense, to the intake part that makes no sense, to the lining up of people that's an untapped opportunity for engagement, to how you deliver meals, to when someone talks to them about housing, to when people are assigned housing case managers if you do that, to when coordinated access happens. I'm always amazed at how analytical people with lived experience can be in improving our programs if we empower them with a voice to deliver that feedback. We can also bring trained peers into the mix to do what? One, normalize the experience of searching for housing, and two, can provide a non-professional support once people move into housing. This is especially great with some of those individuals and families that move into housing that don't need permanent supports, don't need a rapid rehousing level short-term support, but will benefit from someone who's just trying to work through the ropes with them a little bit. Peers can also be great at reviewing your policies, rules, and procedures that may be interfering with the process of getting people housed. This is great when we look at the work around some of the rules-based, and in particular, service restriction or barring that's occurred, and gathering feedback from people who use the experience of being in shelter to better inform what those policies or rules or expectations could look like in the future, so that you spend less time policing the people who are in your shelter and more time serving the people in shelter. Housing peers can be an asset in finding more units, and it can be incentivized. So in this regard, we look at people that have already been housed out of the shelter, and you might say, look, if we got you housed out of the shelter and you find another unit for rent, given so hard it is to find units for rent in most communities throughout the country, we'll give you 50 bucks. Before you know it, you don't just have your eyes out there, and you don't just have the lists on Kijiji or Craigslist that you're scouring through. You have people that you've already housed who become instruments of finding additional units and empowering them and respecting their participation in that process. We can also break through fears of being housed or ambiguity of being housed. Again, using trained peers, so it's not re-traumatizing for them, to walk through their experience to normalize that journey. And these peers should be trained to know how to share power and knowledge, not to inadvertently or deliberately try to be peer counselors. Next up is this idea of mutuality and collaboration. We do housing with people. The entire experience is promoted, but it's voluntary. We're not forcing people to accept housing. Housing is therapeutic, but one doesn't need to be a therapist to assist with housing. And if we think about the therapeutic aspects or opportunities that housing presents, we can very clearly get into a sense of saying, you know what? If I were to be asked, what's more therapeutic? Someone staying in the shelter for a long period of time or someone having housing on their own most of the time, and you think about which environment is more conducive to recovery, most of the time, the answer is going to be a place that isn't the shelter. Not because your shelter's bad, but because shelters are often busy and noisy and have events that goes on that can interfere with the time that you'd want to spend with a helping professional or trained peer. The housing search, acquisition, and move-in process, I'll say, is a partnership between shelter staff and the shelter guest. And if we enter into this partnership, it means that you are going to utilize the strengths that every single partner brings into the process, as opposed to thinking that they have none, which leads us to this place of progressive engagement and mutuality and collaboration. I don't overserve you. I don't think that you do nothing. I actually work with the strengths that you have to achieve the intended outcome. And you're probably not housing focused if you think that shelter staff are responsible for shouldering the entire load of getting everybody housed. Housing focused shelter is not, can I get the biggest staff team? Housing focused shelter is not, can I get staff to just focus on housing and never focus on any of the other aspects of what it takes to operate a shelter safely and appropriately? No. It just means that if we have every single person within a shelter who's working with guests to focus on housing, then we have that partnership in place. Back to what I said a moment ago on the first part of the slide, it's not doing housing to you, it's not doing housing for you, it's doing housing with you. It means we're not saying to shelter guests, yes, drop your housing problem on my lap and I will fix it for you. It is, let's talk about your housing process and collectively figure out the ability to move forward, even if there are barriers or shortcomings in the housing process. Staff are sensitive to the ethical considerations of assisting people in housing. This is particularly true with very vulnerable people, where we probably need a bit more due diligence around the ways in which they're supported, as well as how we communicate with individuals. So we're not thrusting this upon people in ways that are inappropriate. And housing can assist with healing. It doesn't mean that every person gets healed in housing or that every person recovers in housing, but ultimately, housing access is a part of the healing process. And so if we're not focused on provision of housing, if we're just focusing on sheltering, we're going to have a problem. And that problem is shelters will just beget more shelters. There won't be enough throughput. And if there's not enough throughput and we're not helping people go on, and we are holding on to people longer and longer and longer in a more therapeutic realm, then what's the threshold of healing that people have to make before you deem them to be worthy of being housed? It turns out entirely broken people are fantastic at being housed. And then there's empowerment, voice, and choice. Empowered and passively supported in resolving their own homelessness early on in their stay, not waiting for coordinated access. This is why we need to give people a period of grace to try and resolve their homelessness before we go down the road of looking at whether or not they're eligible for supported housing or rapid rehousing or some sort of time limited rent supplement, etc. That we need to empower people to demonstrate their strengths and resiliency and progressively engage within that space. It's not empowering to neuter people's desire upon arrival to say, don't worry about it, you poor thing, we'll figure out the housing for you. Shelter guests must be given an active voice in finding and selecting housing opportunities that are best for them. Now, it's relative to what they can afford, what's appropriate, and what can be put in action. And I'll stop here just for a moment to deal with the elephant in the room that comes up just about every single time I say that, which is, where's the housing, Ian? Do me a favor. Let's continue to advocate for more affordable housing. We absolutely need it. Let's absolutely have the conversation about motel conversion and apartment acquisition and converting other spaces through renovation and rehabilitation to be great housing locations. Let's absolutely do that. And at the same time, do me a favor. Look at the volume of people in your community currently receiving income assistance who are housed. Then ask yourself, how did all of them find housing without you? When was the last time you went out into the community to talk to peers, people who are living in economic poverty who never become homeless, and tap into their knowledge of how they figure out how to find housing without you? Am I saying their lives are great? No, I'm saying that people are resilient and they're fantastic problem solvers. And it's that energy that we need to tap into to be part of the process of empowering people and giving them voice and choice. And in the choice process, even if someone says, look, I don't want to live in place X, Y, or Z, we say, okay, we'll continue to work with you to find A, B, and C. Might that mean someone stays in shelter longer? Yes. But it doesn't mean we abandon the process of trying to work with people to empower them to be part of the housing solution on their own. We don't say, well, I showed you 3 places, so I'm done. You're just going to have to wait this out. I get all these other people that need to get housed. That's not person-centered, and it's probably going to be re-traumatizing or more traumatizing for the person that you've just rejected. Expectations are made clear and transparent, and guests make a conscious choice to participate in what's being offered. Which is why we need to be talking about housing at diversion, at intake, during rapid resolution, at that 14 to 30 day mark, and then putting different strategies in place post 30 days as necessary. It will be unique to every single person, and it should be unique to every single person. When you change the culture of housing focus within your shelter, expect that guests will continue to advocate for themselves about housing in ways that you might have never thought possible. There's one shelter in Western Canada that we've done some work with, and when they started going towards being housing focused and started doing blitzes towards housing, I mean, they actually had guests coming up to staff talking about housing, not staff going up to guests, the other way around. Guests going up to staff advocating for themselves in the housing process. That's a remarkably strong sign that people are feeling empowered to be part of the housing process. And lastly, before I take questions, just at a high level, trauma, housing, and various population groups. With more time, I'd go deeper into all of these, but suffice to say, these are types of groups of people. It's not an exhaustive list. That there has been conversations, often amongst housing-focused shelters and other shelters in their community. So they're not necessarily conversations they've had with us, that people kind of will push back sometimes and say either it's not trauma-informed or housing focus is impossible. We'll start with survivors of violence and violence exposure. And I briefly talked before around rates of violence amongst people experiencing homelessness are much higher than the rates of violence amongst people experiencing housing. In fact, housing can be a violence interrupting strategy for some individuals and create a place of healing that's free from violence with appropriate safety planning and supports in place. Survivors of sexual violence. If you look at the Canadian statistics, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 8 men will experience sexual violence at some point in their life. This is also more likely to be found amongst people experiencing economic poverty, including people experiencing homelessness. If we want to create an environment where people can actually work through the issues of experiencing sexual violence as a survivor in a way that is both trauma-informed and supported, do we want to keep people in shelters longer to do that, or do we want to provide those supports in community once people get housed? People who are transgendered. We know rates of violence against people who are transgendered is high. We know transphobia is high. We know that discrimination and stigmatization is quite high amongst people who identify as transgendered. We know that lots of shelters struggle with ways to be trans allies in the delivery of sleeping spaces and access to restrooms. We also know that some shelters based upon local culture struggle to train their staff to be effective at working with people who identify as transgendered. What if we gave people who are transgendered the autonomy to be more of themselves without trying to subscribe to the boxes that a shelter might put around them through the provision of housing? Women. We know relative to the experience of women's homelessness that violence and abuse are quite often cause of homelessness. We also know that women's homelessness isn't as visible as men's homelessness, but that doesn't mean that less women experience homelessness. That just means that a lot of women's homelessness is hidden on the ability to provide services or to be victimized in exchange for a place to stay. To help break that traumatic cycle, we should be empowering and working with women to find safe places with supports to call their own. Amongst youth, we could have debates over different types of housing models for youth, and that would be a healthy debate to have. But I would still argue that the provision of supports to youth in community decreases exposure to other elements of being in shelter that could be problematic. Immigrants and refugees, especially refugees that have come from war-torn countries, especially those refugees that have experienced time in refugee camps, I would say the experience of helping them access housing is going to be more beneficial over the long term than the potential re-traumatization of being in shelter. But amongst people who use substances, that we have to look at behavior, not the substance use itself. We also have to embrace that substance use as it exists is sometimes a manifestation of a response to trauma. And we'll say that people's recovery from their substance use and engaging with their trauma may be more beneficial within housing than it is within an institutional or shelter setting. Amongst people living with mental illness, as a person who lives with a mental illness, I just find it offensive when people would say it's going to be better for people living with mental illness to stay in shelters longer than it is to be housed and empowered and on a pathway to recovery. And certainly amongst Indigenous people, again, reminding that everybody that home is a social construct, that it can and should look differently for people based upon their specific needs. That is not one size fits all. And we're certainly through a housing focused approach, not asking every single person to subscribe to an exclusively white, male, heteronormative colonial construct of housing. That is the rapid fire approach to trauma-informed delivery of housing-focused shelters. I said I'd talk for about 45 minutes or so, and Tim, let's open up the lines and deal with some questions and answers.
Right on. Thank you, Ian. So we've got a few questions in the Q&A panel, and I'll invite people to put your questions in as you wish and as you're thinking of them. There's a question here, top of the list from Johnny, who's saying, why are we allowing Christian shelters to inflict reoccurring trauma upon Indigenous people, many of whom are residential school survivors and intergenerational trauma survivors, by utilizing scripture as a wake-up call to the clients? Many of us have asked them to stop, but they refuse. Now, this also opens up a question about housing shelter transformation and housing focus for faith-based shelters. I'm interested in your thoughts on anything unique or specific to faith-based shelters and making these changes or becoming trauma-informed.
Well, I think first of all, the perception shared in that question is one that I've shared as well. That on the one hand, I've seen some faith-based organizations live their faith but not evangelize in the process. In other words, some of the shelters that I've experienced that are the most harm reducing, that are the most trauma informed, are operated by people of faith who don't do Bible study, who don't put scripture on the walls, who don't wake people up by reading scripture to them. So I don't think being faith-based precludes you from being trauma-informed and housing-focused. I think it's the delivery of evangelization within that space that you are right to point out can be re-traumatizing to groups like Indigenous people that might be part of residential school survival, can also be triggering and traumatizing to refugees of certain communities and areas where the conflict was religious-based, and now they find themselves needing shelter, and they're confronted by messaging that doesn't necessarily align with their world or views or values, and could be re-traumatizing. And so I do think that we need a separation between what is remarkably good social service or good social work, and where are the right opportunities for evangelization, preaching, and engagement. If shelters want to make it completely voluntary to participate in those, and it truly comes with no punishment, then I think there's an okay place to have that within shelter. To require it of guests, or to put faith-based scripture all over the walls, or to require prayer before meals, or to read scripture to people to wake them up in the morning, I would say that goes across the line of what's appropriate in a shelter.
Excellent. So, question from Victoria. She's asking, do you suggest having single case managers for each person, or having a team approach, all staff support every client?
Yeah, so this would come back to, great question. When I broke up the 5 different sections, I'll say there's some staff that do diversion, but not all staff. There's some staff that do intake, but not all staff. All staff involved in some degree in rapid resolution, because every staff can be conversant enough and use passive resources to have a conversation about housing in those first 14 days that doesn't require case managers and doesn't require a specialist. When we get beyond that 14-day period, then we see a bit of a funneling process of those people who are there beyond 14 days who have the most intensive needs, and then how do we attach those people to the most intensive needs to try and resolve their homelessness before 30 days. And absolutely, once we get to 30 days, we have to go through a process of prioritizing who would get access to a case manager and who wouldn't. And that will be incumbent upon the size of your shelter and the demands of the volume of people in your shelter. But no, I'm not suggesting everybody gets a housing case manager. So we're thinking more generalist in the early days, and then more specialized further along we get.
Great. Another question here is, how do you motivate a homeless client in shelter who avoids setting goals for themselves for housing?
Right. I think motivation is so varied, right? And it's difficult to measure motivation in people, and it's difficult to understand how much of that is based upon trauma and what seems to be a lack of motivation. And I'm not suggesting this is what you say, but I'll say this has come up in other places. It's what's wrong with that person? Why don't they want to set goals, right? And I think the opposite approach. What happened to this person so they struggle to set goals and reach them? And then what do I need to do differently to engage? And if I think about that, and I reframe my entire shelter to being housing focused, so that messaging is in place. At diversion, they knew you're going to focus on housing. At intake, they knew you're going to focus on housing. In those first 2 weeks in shelter, it was relentless that you're focusing on housing. That then maybe you did get a case manager or someone assigned you to talk about housing. That because it's been housing, and housing along the way, it's not like the guests in that environment can say, "Oh, I didn't know that I was supposed to be working on housing." Now, that said, again, not so naive, some people experiencing homelessness are amongst the most stealthy I've ever experienced in my life. You might want to have a conversation about goals or housing, and they never seem to be around when you want to have that conversation. So unrelenting pursuit, and in times a bit of an all-staff bulletin to figure out what are the ways that we can engage with people to have meaningful conversation, to at least start the conversation about what would a goal look like, as opposed to starting the conversation with what are your goals.
Okay, so Jeffrey's asking, what strategies can a housing-focused shelter use when a guest refuses to engage in the housing search? Similar question.
Yeah, so I think we want to get at what's the root of the resistance. Is it something we said? Is it that housing, in fact, was traumatizing for them? In other words, we need to come at this from a different perspective. because maybe the thing that we're trying to suggest they do is the thing that actually is most triggering for them. And it's not to say that we abandon our housing goals, but we might go a different process of supporting people in that sort of makeup and unpack, especially if someone is trained, what are the causes of that trauma associated with housing for the individual. I'm not suggesting you all become therapists and start trying to unpack. And I also would say that for those individuals, I don't want to set ultimatums, but I do want to ask them to articulate what do they think is the value add of being in shelter and not focused on housing. Because it could be, for example, that they like the congregate environment, in which case, let's look at congregate housing opportunities. It could be they like that meals are provided for them. Well, I don't know. I mean, some communities, you can get access to like Meals on Wheels for people who aren't seniors. I mean, there's different ways of trying to solve these problems in ways that may demystify the housing process for people. But again, trying to be non-punitive in that encounter with individuals.
Okay. Another question here, an anonymous question in the comment asking, in Ottawa and all over Canada, there's so much discrimination against Indigenous populations trying to obtain housing, especially for those individuals whom are reaching out from shelters, which is against human rights. How can we as a community band together and help with this?
Well, the part I like about that question is the banding together to try to figure this out, because I don't think I'm going to have an absolute answer, and I don't think we should rely on any one person to have the answer to this particular question. I think there is the human rights angle and, you know, drawing attention to that, but I'll also say that that can come with some people being even more improperly served after that. Oh, you created a fuss? Oh, I'll show you what happens when you create a fuss trying to rent from my building. So I think that can have blowback. And sometimes that fight is worth it and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's worth it to have a lawyer who is willing to provide pro bono services to write a strongly worded letter on behalf of, doesn't mention a specific person or a specific shelter, just has come to their attention that there's been discrimination against Indigenous people. I've seen that used, you know, I'll say not 100% effective, but somewhat effective at opening up. I've seen municipalities start to lead the conversation, having political leadership lead that conversation in different ways around as a community, so that shelters aren't feeling alone, and so people who are Indigenous within those shelters don't feel alone in their pursuit of housing. So I've certainly seen elements of that be effective. And then the last thing that I'll say that I've seen effective, and certainly I'd love to hear what other ideas people come up with in this regard, is starting to go down the road of having some units that are master leased, in which case you as a service provider are deciding who moves into that unit, not the landlord themselves. And then you can kind of get to a critical mass of demonstrating that all that discrimination is completely unfounded and unjustified.
Excellent. So a couple of last questions and comments. One, I'll give you an opportunity to reply to. One is John has mentioned in the chat that he says he thinks it's wrong, is a wrong perception of stereotyping faith-based shelters as shelters who mistreat clients. Wondered if you had any thoughts or reactions to that comment.
And I was trying to make this clear, but let me try it again. I think some of the most courageous, best shelter providers I've ever met are faith-based. I think some of the most housing-focused shelters I've ever met are faith-based. I think some of the most talented people I've ever met working in shelters are faith-based. But I draw a distinction between being faith-based and delivering a professional social service versus using your shelter as a place of evangelization. And that, I think, is when we cross a line where we are expecting people to participate or be witness to religious practices that should be detached from the experience of being sheltered.
Right. One last question before we wrap, and that's, are there shelters in Canada or shelters in the US that you know that are doing this really well?
Yes.
For example?
Well, I think that, well, there's a few that come to mind. I think that in the US, they often point to Crossroads, Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island, as one of the first shelters to firmly adopt being housing focused. So they have one of the longest track records at actually following their data over their journey, and not just diversion, but shortening length of stay increase housing outcomes, those sorts of things. And you can find literature on them through the National Alliance to End Homelessness website in DC, endhomelessness.org. And they've been conference presenters in the US in the past. Another one in the US, I mentioned Grace Marketplace in Gainesville. I think they're doing some great work. In Canada, I think we're growing the body of evidence, but I'm not going to tell you what their data is because it was fantastic, but it's their story to tell. Calgary Drop-In has really been doing an excellent job at continuing to transform what is the largest shelter in Canada into perhaps one of the most housing-focused shelters anybody will ever meet. Now, this doesn't mean that any of these shelters, whether it's Crossroads or Grace Marketplace or Calgary Drop-In, I also earlier mentioned Mission Services in Hamilton is going down this road. I think that they're not perfect, but they are so embedded in embracing the process of trying to be as best as possible at being housing focused and are living it and breathing it in their DNA. And one of the ideas that I had and Tim and I have discussed is a future webinar, maybe in the new year, where we're gonna get some of these housing focused shelters to do a presentation themselves on their journey to becoming more housing focused. So stay tuned to that.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you very much, Ian. I think this will draw things to a close. I just want to let folks know when the other webinars are. We've got scheduled in October, November, and December. You see the dates and times up on the screen. There to register for these webinars, you can go to transformshelter.ca/webinar. That's where you will also find recording of this webinar. So with that, I will say thank you very much to Ian, and thank you very much to everybody who joined us and who participated. Looking forward to our next webinar on October 22nd at 1 p.m. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you all for your work and the work that you're doing every day. Thank you for joining us. And I look forward to seeing all of you again very soon, seeing you, or at least hearing from you all very soon. Thank you all. Have an amazing day. Thanks, Ian.
Thanks.